Officer Eric Simmons had built his career on fear. For 10 years, he ruled the streets of Pine Haven, not as a protector, but as a predator. His badge wasn't a symbol of justice, it was a weapon, a tool he used to intimidate, manipulate, and control. He had perfected the art of racial profiling, of making his harassment look justifiable in a report. Subject exhibited suspicious behavior. Officer feared for safety. The same tired excuses, repeated over and over, each one a shield against accountability. Other officers whispered about him, but no one dared challenge him. He had friends in high places, a spotless record, on paper at least, and a reputation for bringing in numbers that made the precinct look good. Traffic stops, arrests, citations. It didn't matter if the charges stuck. What mattered was control. He thrived on it. Eric Simmons was the kind of cop who parked his cruiser outside black-owned businesses watching. The kind who followed black drivers for miles, waiting for any excuse to flash his lights. The kind who had no problem escalating a situation just to remind people who was in charge. Pine Haven's minority communities knew his face, knew his name, knew that if Officer Simmons stopped you, the best thing to do was stay quiet and hope you got to leave without bruises. He had stopped Marcus Reynolds, a high school teacher, for looking out of place while jogging in his own neighborhood. He had detained Vanessa Reynolds, an elderly black woman, for taking too long to cross the street, and he had laughed about it later in the locker room. "They should be grateful I didn't take them in," he'd say, smirking as he adjusted his badge. No one called him out. No one ever did, because Simmons was untouchable, or at least he thought he was. That was before the day he pulled over the wrong car. He thought it would be like every other stop. Another excuse, another moment of control, another victim too afraid to fight back. But behind the wheel that day wasn't just anyone. It was Lieutenant Colonel Clara Johnson, a highly decorated military officer, someone who had spent 2 decades teaching soldiers how to handle authority, someone who knew exactly how to fight back. And fight back she did. What happened next would shatter everything Simmons thought he knew about power, because karma had just arrived. And it wasn't taking prisoners. Somehow, those complaints against Officer Eric Simmons just kept disappearing. The reports were filed, the witnesses spoke, but nothing ever came of it. The department had a way of making problems go away, especially when it involved one of their own. In the break room, officers whispered about it. "Did you hear what Simmons did today?" they'd murmur. But no one ever took it further. Not when he had friends in high places, not when his numbers looked good on paper. Traffic stops, arrests, citations. He was a high performer. That's what the brass liked to call him. Who would believe a citizen's word over a decorated officer's report? Certainly not the review board, and definitely not the people who signed his paychecks. That was the beauty of power. It wasn't about who was right, it was about who controlled the story. And Simmons? He controlled the story. He thrived on it. You could see it in the way he walked through the precinct, chest puffed out like he was invincible. You could hear it in the smug way he dismissed another complaint. "Just doing my job," he'd say with that self-satisfied grin, flipping his badge between his fingers like a lucky coin. That badge was more than just an emblem of law enforcement. It was his armor, his weapon, his permission slip to do whatever he pleased. And man, did he want everyone to know it. The thing about men like Eric Simmons is that they start believing their own lies. They start thinking they're untouchable. They forget that every empire, no matter how strong, eventually falls. Because karma doesn't care about your badge. It doesn't care how many arrests you've made or how many higher-ups have your back. Karma comes when you least expect it. And for Officer Eric Simmons, karma was about to arrive in the form of someone who knew exactly how to handle bullies in uniform. Let me introduce you to Lieutenant Colonel Clara Johnson, 20 years of distinguished military service, 2 tours in Afghanistan, more commendations than Simmons had parking tickets in his quota book. But you wouldn't know any of that by looking at her. She wasn't the type to brag. Most days, you'd find Clara at the Pine Haven Veterans Support Center, helping fellow vets navigate the very system she knew like the back of her hand. "Everyone deserves a fighting chance," she always said, and she meant it. That Tuesday morning started like any other. Clara was heading to the Veterans Center in her modest Toyota Camry, completely unaware that she was about to cross paths with the one man arrogant enough to pick the wrong fight. Nothing flashy, that wasn't her style. Lieutenant Colonel Clara Johnson had just finished her morning run. the crisp autumn air still lingering on her skin. She wore the same Army PT shirt she had worn countless times before, a symbol of discipline, resilience, and a lifetime of service. She wasn't one for dramatics, nor did she ever seek attention. But today, attention was coming her way whether she wanted it or not. Clara had learned long ago that being a black woman in the military meant fighting twice as hard for half the recognition. She had spent years proving herself, excelling in every test, every deployment, every mission. And yet, there were always those who looked at her and saw only what they wanted to see. But she never let it stop her. Excellence is the best response to ignorance, she often told the young recruits she mentored. As she came to a red light, she noticed something in her rearview mirror, a patrol car creeping up behind her. It wasn't unusual, but the way the officer was staring through his windshield, his posture, the way his fingers gripped the wheel, it made something in her gut tighten. 20 years of service had given Clara a sharp instinct for danger, an ability to read a situation in seconds. And right now, something wasn't right. She did what she always did. Checked her seatbelt, turned down the radio, and kept both hands visible on the steering wheel. Standard procedure. The same training she had drilled into military police recruits over the years. The light turned green. She drove exactly the speed limit. The patrol car stayed behind her. Too close. Close enough that she could barely see its hood in her mirror. 3 blocks. 4 blocks. Still there. She knew this game. She'd seen it too many times before. Then came the lights. The familiar red and blue flashes in her rear view. Clara exhaled, not in fear, but in disappointment. Another day in America. Another unnecessary stop. But this time, it was going to be different. Because Officer Eric Simmons had no idea who he had just pulled over. He didn't know he was about to confront someone who had spent 2 decades training military police on the correct way to handle authority. Someone who documented everything. Someone who knew every single regulation he was about to break. Clara reached slowly, deliberately for her documents, keeping her movements measured and clear. Years of training had drilled this into her. Never give them an excuse. "I'm reaching for my credentials in the glove compartment, officer," she said evenly, narrating each step. She pulled out 3 items: her driver's license, vehicle registration, and military ID. Officer Eric Simmons barely glanced at the first 2, but the moment his eyes landed on the military ID, his whole demeanor shifted. He didn't look impressed. He looked suspicious. "You expect me to believe this is real?" he scoffed. Clara kept her expression neutral. Her voice remained steady. "Yes, sir, I'm Lieutenant Colonel Clara Johnson, currently stationed at..." Simmons cut her off with a laugh. "Right. And I'm the Secretary of Defense." His hand moved to his holster. "Step out of the vehicle, now." Clara had been in tougher situations than this. She had been in war zones, had stood face to face with real threats. But something about the way Simmons' fingers twitched near his weapon, the way his eyes narrowed, sent a clear message. This wasn't about any traffic violation. Her eyes flicked to his nameplate. "Officer Simmons," she said, keeping her voice professional, measured. "May I ask why I'm being ordered to exit my vehicle?" She already had her phone recording propped up on the dashboard. Another habit drilled into her from years of training others. Document everything. Always. "Because I said so," Simmons snapped. His face reddened with irritation. "And turn off that phone. Now." Clara didn't move. "Sir, I have the right to record this interaction," she said firmly. "Can you please state the reason for this stop?" That's when Simmons' smirk twisted into something uglier. "Oh, playing lawyer now," he sneered. He stepped closer, his voice dropping into a mockingly casual tone. "Fine, I saw you swerving. Probably drunk. Out, now." Clara knew she hadn't swerved once. Her dashcam would prove it later. Still, she complied, calm, controlled, unshaken. By now, other cars had slowed down, eyes watching. Simmons didn't care. The moment she was out, his hand clamped onto her arm, too tight, rough enough to leave a bruise. "Spread your legs." Hands on the car. Clara's breath was even, her voice clear. "Officer, I believe this constitutes excessive force." The cold steel of handcuffs snapped around her wrists before she could finish. Simmons smiled. Officer Eric Simmons leaned in close, his breath hot against Clara's ear as he shoved her toward his patrol car. "Not so high and mighty now, are we, Colonel?" he sneered. Clara caught a glimpse of her phone still recording from the dashboard. Good. Every second of this was evidence, and she knew that look in Simmons' eyes, the one she had seen too many times before in men who mistook power for invincibility. But Lieutenant Colonel Clara Johnson hadn't spent 20 years serving her country just to be bullied by a man who dishonored his badge. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every single person Simmons had harassed, every abuse of power he had gotten away with. And as they drove toward the station, Simmons feeling victorious in the driver's seat, Clara was already planning her next move. Because while Simmons thought he had taken in another victim, he had actually just started a war with someone who knew exactly how to fight it. The booking room at Bayview Precinct was cold, deliberately cold, designed to break people down. But Clara had endured conditions far worse in the deserts of Afghanistan, in war rooms where decisions meant life or death. This was nothing. Simmons strutted toward the front desk, his chest puffed out, confidence oozing from every step. He waved her military ID like a trophy, his voice ringing out loud enough for everyone to hear. Looks like we got ourselves a fake military officer, boys. Several officers in the room shifted uncomfortably. Something wasn't right, and they could feel it. And then Sergeant Natalie Parker stepped in. Unlike Simmons, she actually checked the military ID properly. The moment her eyes scanned the credentials, her expression changed. Her voice dropped, but it wasn't quiet enough. "Are you crazy?" she hissed, yanking Simmons aside. "Do you know who she is?" Simmons's face flushed red. He tried to cover. She was resisting, being combative. Parker cut him off. "The dash cam better back that up." She turned to Clara. "Ma'am, I'm going to remove these cuffs." Clara stayed seated. Her voice was calm, measured, unshaken. "Actually, Sergeant, I'd prefer if you left them on for now." Clara remained calm, measured. "I want everything documented exactly as it is," she said, her voice even, controlled. She turned slightly, making sure the station's security cameras got a clear view of the bruises forming on her arms. Evidence. For the first time, Simmons' smirk began to fade. Doubt crept into his once confident eyes. Clara had seen that look before. The moment a bully realizes they've picked the wrong target. She lifted her chin. "I'd like to make my phone call now." Not to a lawyer, no. She called Colonel Daniel Cooper, the judge advocate general she had worked with for 15 years, and she kept the call on speaker. Every officer in that room heard exactly who she was and what was coming. "You have exactly 1 hour to release Lieutenant Colonel Johnson," Cooper's booming voice filled the room, "before I personally contact the police commissioner, the mayor's office, and the Department of Justice." The station erupted into action. Sergeant Natalie Parker was already pulling Simmons into an office. The cuffs came off. Forms were being shredded. But Clara wasn't done. She stood up, rubbed her wrists, then turned to face the room. "I want every officer who witnessed this to know something," she said, her voice carrying the weight of 2 decades of command. "What happened today? It ends here, not just for me. For everyone who couldn't fight back. For everyone who didn't have a Colonel Cooper to call." As she walked out of the station, Clara pulled out her phone, but not to call the media, not to call a civil rights attorney. No, this call was to someone who had been collecting complaints against Simmons for years, waiting for a case strong enough to stick. Because Clara Johnson didn't just want Simmons suspended. She wanted to change the entire system that made him think he could get away with it. And now she had enough evidence to do exactly that. The next morning, Simmons strolled into the precinct, still clinging to the illusion that none of this mattered. But he was about to find out. His time was up. Officer Eric Simmons strolled into Bayview Precinct like nothing had happened. Then he noticed the stares, the whispers. His usual parking spot was taken. His coffee mug was gone from the break room. Little things, warning signs. He chose to ignore them. "Just another complaint," he told his partner, forcing confidence into his voice. "They always go away." But his partner just shook his head, and then requested a transfer to another unit. The first domino had fallen. Meanwhile, across town, Lieutenant Colonel Clara Johnson sat in a small office with Internal Affairs investigator Madeline Brooks. "Show me everything," Clara said, placing a USB drive on the desk. Not just her dash cam footage, not just her phone recording. She had something better. For the past 5 years, Clara explained, Veterans from my support group have been documenting every interaction with Officer Simmons. She opened a spreadsheet, dates, names, incidents, witnesses, all meticulously organized. We're military, Clara said simply. Documentation is what we do. Brooke's eyes widened as she scrolled through the data. 37 incidents, 15 formal complaints, all buried until now. This is thorough, Brooks admitted. Clara wasn't finished. Check your email, she said. I just sent you statements from 3 officers who've witnessed Simmons's behavior. They're ready to talk. Back at the precinct, Simmons's confidence was cracking. His phone kept buzzing with messages from his union rep. Don't talk to anyone. We have a situation. But Simmons wasn't listening. He never did. This is harassment, he shouted in the captain's office. That woman is lying. The captain didn't say a word. He just silently slid a folder across the desk. Inside, photos of Clara's bruised arms, her military record, her commendations, and something that made Simmons' blood run cold, a list of all his previous targets. You didn't think they'd find each other, did you? The captain asked quietly, his eyes cold. You didn't think they'd organize, share stories, build a case. Officer Eric Simmons sank into a chair. His badge, once a symbol of power, suddenly felt heavy on his chest. But the real blow came that afternoon. As Simmons left the precinct, he saw them. A group of 36 people standing quietly on the sidewalk. Former targets, veterans, teachers, parents. Regular people he had harassed over the years. They weren't protesting. They weren't shouting. They were just watching, waiting, each holding a folder, their documented incident. And standing among them, calm, composed, Lieutenant Colonel Clara Johnson. But she wasn't looking at Simmons. She was talking to a young officer who had approached the group. This isn't about revenge, she explained, her voice measured. This is about accountability, about making sure what happened to us never happens to anyone else. Simmons' hands shook as he fumbled with his keys. For the first time in his career, he felt what his victims had felt. Powerless. But this was just the beginning, because tomorrow was his hearing, and Clara Johnson had only shown the first page of her evidence. The hearing room was packed. Simmons sat alone at his table, his union lawyer nervously shuffling papers beside him. The confident smirk was gone, replaced by something new. Fear, real fear, the kind his victims knew all too well. Then Clara entered, wearing her full military dress uniform. No theatrics, no drama, just presence. The room fell silent. Behind her, the witnesses followed. One by one, Marcus Reynolds, the teacher, Vanessa Reynolds, the elderly woman, dozens more, each carrying their story, their proof. The review board chairman cleared his throat. Officer Simmons, we are here today to... Simmons' lawyer cut in. My client wishes to make a statement. Simmons stood, straightening his tie, still trying to control the narrative. Eric Simmons still believed he could talk his way out of this. Everything I did was by the book, he declared, trying to inject authority into his voice. I was protecting our community. These people, the chairman raised a hand, cutting him off. Officer Simmons, before you continue, I suggest you watch this. The lights dimmed, a projector flickered to life, and then his own dash cam footage began playing. Not just from Clara Johnson's arrest, from dozens of stops. His voice, his words, his actions. Every lie, every abuse of power, every moment he thought no one would ever piece together. Stop the video, Simmons' lawyer barked, rising from his chair. But it was too late. The pattern was clear. The abuse of power undeniable. Simmons slumped in his chair, his face pale as his own actions testified against him. Then Clara Johnson took the stand. Her testimony was brief, precise, devastating. No anger, no accusations, just facts, dates, times, violations of procedure. She spoke as if she were giving a military briefing, each word another nail in Simmons' career coffin. This isn't just about one officer, she concluded. This is about trust, about the badge, about what happens when we let power go unchecked. The review board members were taking notes, lots of notes. Then came the surprise witness, Officer Rebecca Carter, Simmons' former rookie partner. She stood, visibly shaken, but her voice held firm. I was taught to protect and serve, she said. But what I saw, what he made me participate in, Her voice caught. Her testimony brought several board members to tears. Simmons' lawyer slid him a note across the table. 2 words. Take deal. Simmons crumpled it up in his fist. He still couldn't believe this was happening. Still couldn't accept that his actions had consequences. Still thought his badge would save him. The chairman called a recess. As people filed out, Clara overheard 2 board members talking. In 20 years, one whispered, shaking his head. I've never seen evidence this thorough. The other nodded grimly. This isn't just a case. It's a wake-up call. Meanwhile, Simmons stood alone by the water cooler, staring at his own reflection in the metal surface. For the first time in his life, he knew he wasn't untouchable anymore. Eric Simmons stood alone, his former colleagues avoiding eye contact as they passed him in the hallway. For years, he had hidden behind the thin blue line, the unspoken code of silence that protected cops like him. But now that shield was gone. And the worst part? This was only day 1 of the hearing. Day 2 began with a bombshell. Sergeant Natalie Parker took the stand, her hands steady as she opened a worn leather notebook. I've documented every concerning incident involving Officer Simmons for the past 3 years, she stated. I just never had enough proof to act, until now. Simmons's face went pale. His own supervisor, the one he had bragged to countless times about his methods. She had been recording everything. The times he laughed about making people cry at him. The racist jokes. The threats against complainants. She flipped a page. On March 15th, she read, Officer Simmons stated, and I quote, "These people need to learn their place." The room fell silent. The board members exchanged glances. Simmons's lawyer stopped taking notes. Then came the real turning point. An unexpected source. Catherine Lewis, the IT specialist from the precinct, wheeled in a cart of hard drives. Officer Simmons asked me to clean up some dash cam footage last year, she said quietly. I made copies instead. The footage played. Simmons' own voice filled the room. Turn off that camera. Delete this. This never happened. Each clip another nail in his coffin, each command proving consciousness of guilt, each moment showing exactly who he was when he thought no one was watching. Clara Johnson sat silently, watching Simmons' world crumble, not with satisfaction, but with a soldier's understanding of duty. This wasn't revenge. This was accountability. Then Clara's advocate stood. I have one more witness. The doors opened, and in walked Katie Simmons. Katie Simmons stepped into the room, her rookie uniform crisp, her face resolute. Her father half stood, stunned. Katie, don't. I'm sorry, Dad, she said, her voice firm, unwavering. But what you did, what you taught me, was wrong. She looked at the board members, then at the officers in the room. I became a cop to protect people. All people. Her testimony was the final blow. She spoke of growing up, watching her father abuse his power, twisting the badge into a shield for his cruelty. The room fell silent. There were no dry eyes. Even seasoned officers shifted uncomfortably, as if seeing themselves in the reflection of her words. For the first time, Eric Simmons cracked. The arrogance, the bravado, 20 years of untouchable power crumbled in an instant. I never meant, he stammered, but there was nowhere left to hide, no excuse that could cover the truth. As the day ended, Clara Johnson overheard 2 veteran officers talking. You know what's crazy? One muttered. She could have gone for revenge, could have made this ugly. Instead, the other officer nodded. She showed us how to clean our own house. The board chairman announced they would deliver their decision tomorrow, but everyone in that room already knew. Justice doesn't always come with a bang. Sometimes it comes with paperwork, with witnesses, with the quiet courage of people finally standing up to say, no more. The hearing room was standing room only, packed with officers, community members, even a few retired judges, because this wasn't just about Eric Simmons anymore. This was about setting a precedent. Simmons sat slumped at his table, his uniform wrinkled, his badge conspicuously absent. The man who once swaggered through the precinct could barely meet anyone's eyes. His lawyer had stopped objecting. The evidence was overwhelming. The board chairman cleared his throat. Before we announce our decision, Lieutenant Colonel Clara Johnson has requested to make a final statement. Clara approached the podium, her posture perfect, her voice clear. I'm not here to destroy Officer Simmons, she began. I'm here because power without accountability always destroys itself. Clara stood before a new class of police cadets, The weight of the moment not lost on her. Her military uniform was gone, replaced by a civilian suit, but her discipline remained the same. The training program she had helped design was now mandatory across 3 counties. More importantly, complaints of police abuse had dropped by 60%. Real, tangible change. Simmons, last she heard, was working as a night security guard at a mall, a humbling fall for a man who once thrived on unchecked power. Now he had to answer to authority instead of wielding it. The irony was not lost on anyone. His daughter, Katie Simmons, took the opposite path. She became one of the department's most respected officers, known for fairness, integrity, and community engagement. She didn't just wear the badge, she honored it. But the real change wasn't in the statistics or the policies. It was in the small moments. Like when Sergeant Natalie Parker pulled over a young black teenager last week. The boy was terrified, gripping the wheel with shaking hands. Until Parker did something different. She explained exactly why she had stopped him. She showed him that her body camera was recording. She treated him with respect, and just like that, his fear turned into understanding. That is what real policing looks like. That is the kind of change that matters. Clara still volunteers at the Pine Haven Veterans Support Center, still helps former soldiers navigate the system. But now, others come to her with their stories. Stories of standing up to abuse of power. Not just against police corruption. Against anyone who thinks authority means immunity. Because this story, it was never just about one bad cop getting what he deserved. It was about what happens when people choose to stand up. When they document everything. When they fight smart instead of fighting angry. It was about using the system's own rules to fix the system. Because bullies don't stop being bullies until someone shows them they are not untouchable. And that someone, it could be you. It could be anyone who decides enough is enough. So the next time you see someone abusing their power, whether it's a cop, a boss, a politician, or anyone who believes their authority makes them above consequences, remember Lieutenant Colonel Clara Johnson. Remember that one person, armed with courage, evidence, and determination, can change everything. Because karma, it's not just some mystical force. Sometimes it arrives in a Toyota Camry, wearing an Army PT shirt, with 20 years of service, and a perfect understanding of exactly how to fight back. If this story has taught us anything, it's that justice doesn't always wear a cape. Sometimes it wears stripes earned through years of service. Sometimes it carries a folder full of evidence instead of a weapon. And sometimes, just sometimes, it wins. The story of Lieutenant Colonel Clara Johnson and Officer Eric Simmons is more than just an account of a corrupt officer facing justice. It is a powerful lesson about accountability, courage, and the responsibility that comes with authority. It teaches us that power without oversight leads to abuse. But when ordinary people choose to stand up, real change is possible. Clara did not fight Simmons with anger or vengeance. She fought smartly, strategically, and within the very system that had allowed him to thrive unchecked for years. This highlights an essential truth. Fixing a broken system requires patience, persistence, and undeniable evidence. It is not enough to call out injustice. We must document it, build a case, and demand real consequences. Another key lesson is that silence enables corruption. For years, Simmons was protected by a culture of complacency. His colleagues saw his actions but chose to look the other way. They whispered about his abuses in break rooms, but no one dared challenge him because they feared retaliation or believed nothing would change. Clara's story proves that change does not start with an institution. It starts with individuals willing to speak up. It only took one person to gather the right evidence, rally the right voices, and expose the truth, and suddenly the entire department could no longer ignore what had been happening in plain sight. This is the power of collective action. The story also reveals an important truth about what it means to wear a badge or hold any position of authority. A badge should not be a shield for wrongdoing. It should be a symbol of responsibility. Katie Simmons, the daughter of the disgraced officer, understood this deeply. Unlike her father, she chose to uphold the law with integrity, fairness, and respect. Her decision serves as a reminder that just because a system is flawed does not mean it cannot be changed from within. There will always be those who abuse power, but there will also be those who use it to serve and protect. Most importantly, this story reminds us that anyone can be the catalyst for change. Too often, people assume that injustice is too big to fight, that one voice won't make a difference. But Clara's actions prove otherwise. One voice, backed by truth, evidence, and persistence, can spark a movement. Whether it is police misconduct, workplace discrimination, or any form of abuse, the lesson remains the same. Standing up is not just an option, it is a responsibility. Justice does not always come swiftly or easily. It does not always come with a dramatic moment in court or a shocking revelation. Sometimes justice is built through years of careful work, through policies changed, through cultures shifted. And sometimes justice looks like a young police officer explaining a traffic stop with respect instead of fear, a simple act that signals a new beginning. The lesson is clear. Change begins when someone decides enough is enough. And that someone, it could be any of us.